question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Whitlam.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I want to say at the outset that we'll be moving a second reading amendment at the conclusion of my comments. So my comments today will go to the second reading amendment and to the bill. I want to say at the outset that Labor will be supporting the bill. The three amendments it makes to Treasury laws are relatively minor and not controversial, in as far as they go. That said, the second reading amendment that will be moved, which has been circulated in my name, highlights some specific failings of this government, which I will come to in due course. But before I do that, I want to go through the bill and why Labor will support it. Schedule 1 relates to the collection of data from companies operating in the gig economy by the Australian Tax Office. It implements a measure recommended by the Black Economy Task Force some 2 years ago and is aimed at ensuring electronic platform operators pay the correct amount of tax. Some of those platform operators argued during this inquiry that the data gathering requirements were too onerous. Well, we did not agree. We took the same view as the Tax Institute, that the platform providers are well placed to collect such data. I'm pleased that the majority of the committee which inquired into this bill concurred with Labor's view. Schedule 2 amends the Financial Complaints Authority Act to facilitate the closure of the Superannuation Complaints Tribunal. The tribunal ceased operations in December last year and stopped accepting new cases in November of 2018. So this bill relates to the transfer of information that the tribunal had over to the new body, AFCA, which now handles complaints about superannuation. It is nothing more than housekeeping, and we support those provisions. Schedule 3 removes the $250 non-deductible threshold for taxpayers' work-related self-education expenses from next financial year. This is a welcome but minor change that will make things a touch easier for workers to train themselves up. But unfortunately, Deputy Speaker, it's a paltry effort which represents the sum total of the Morrison government's plan to address the burgeoning skills crisis that is staring them in the face. Now, it's not like this crisis is flying under the radar. Just last week, Infrastructure Australia issued the government its loudest possible warning. It says that within 2 years, 1 in 3 skilled positions needed to build this nation's infrastructure will go unfilled. Just think about that. Over the course of the next few days, members of the National Party are going to press gang the Liberal Party to accept billions and billions of dollars in untested infrastructure projects to assist them to grease through some meagre commitments ahead of the Glasgow Climate Change Summit. Deputy Speaker, wouldn't it be extraordinary if, but for the want of workers, those projects could not go ahead? Or if they do go ahead, they'll go ahead at exceptionally inflated prices. Deputy Speaker, it's 105,000 unfilled job vacancies for a huge variety of skilled jobs: electricians, painters and joiners, engineers and geologists, architects, and the list goes on. These people are quite literally building the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. That's billions of dollars of infrastructure projects we desperately need that are going to be either slowed down or won't be able to proceed at all because of the government's short-sightedness and incompetence on the issue of skills and workforce development. This warning is coming from the government's own independent infrastructure advisor, whose sole purpose is to keep our infrastructure building pipeline on track, to ensure that we don't have a stop and start so that we can ensure that the desperately needed economic infrastructure to build the recovery, to get the economy whirring again, is built and delivered on time. It simply cannot happen unless you have a workforce which is capable of doing it. And yet Infrastructure Australia advises that there are literally thousands of workers who vacancies that will not be able to be filled. This warning, Deputy Speaker, has not been heeded by the government. It's just one sector of the economy, and it's coming at us in 2 to 3 years' time. But as any member of this chamber knows, if they've been listening to small businesses in their electorate, particularly in the hospitality sector, they will know that the skills crisis is already upon us. Desperately. Whether they're bar owners, whether they're cafe owners, whether they're food and beverage establishments, fast food stores, right across the hospitality industry, in accommodation services, there is a desperate shortage of skilled workers. The backpackers aren't filling those jobs as they once did, and it's uncertain that they will be able to fill those jobs, certainly any time this year and unlikely any time in the near future. Hospitality workers, retail workers, building and construction industry workers, Deputy Speaker, if you cannot get a plumber or an electrician or a carpenter to your house to do a desperately needed repair at a decent price, or to do that renovation that you've been thinking about throughout the lockdown, there's a simple reason for it: government failure. Government has failed to invest in skills and apprentices and trainees, and every Australian household is paying the price through the cost of renovation and the cost of simple repairs going up and up and up. There is an answer. People used to come from the rest of the world to study it here in Australia. It's called TAFE. The successive governments, coalition governments with an absolute abject hatred of TAFE, have ripped the guts out of the system so that it will struggle to meet the needs of a growing economy. There's a fashionable view among some who sit opposite that the crisis is something new, brought on by the need to close borders during the pandemic. They no doubt agree with the New South Wales Premier, who is suggesting that we import workers from overseas roughly equal to the population of Perth to solve the problem. Well, let me tell you, they're having themselves on. First of all, there was a crisis before the pandemic. In this government's first 8 years, the number of apprenticeship training places fell by over 100,000 places. Over 100,000 places. Every year, Deputy Speaker, we have seen less and less apprentices and trainees in training, and it's on the heads of this government. And Australian households are paying the price of this today. In other words, if those opposite had done nothing, we'd have had a fighting chance of filling those skilled vacancies that Infrastructure Australia is now warning about. But they didn't do nothing. They cut places, and now it's this nation's workers and businesses who are paying the price. Secondly, and there's a second issue, you can't just simply import 400,000 workers at the drop of a hat. I'm familiar with the situation of accommodation and hospitality workers in the Illawarra and on the south coast. They are met with a twin crisis, a workforce shortage and a housing crisis. That is to say, even if they were able to find workers somewhere in the rest of Australia or the rest of the world to bring them to our region, there's nowhere for them to stay. We have an accommodation crisis and we have a skills crisis. It is upon us and it is choking the economic recovery. And all this mob over here can do is play parlour games as if on those benches opposite us you have the government and the opposition in the one-party room. Deputy Speaker, these challenges are far too big to be subject to the hostage games of the National Party and the internal bickering and squabbling and incompetence that is the coalition government. What you actually need to do is to invest in the long-term industrial future of this country by training local workers. The pandemic is not an excuse to import workers at the expense of reskilling local workers. In a few months' time, there will be hundreds of thousands of kids who will be leaving our schools with a hope of finding a job, an apprenticeship, a traineeship. But we don't have the training places to fill those places and to meet their needs and aspirations. My electorate of Whitlam is a perfect example of why, if anything, the need for investment in skills and training is more urgent than ever. Over the pandemic, over 10,500 workers in the Illawarra lost their job. Now, I hope as the economy starts to open up again, the overwhelming majority of them find their way back into full-time employment. Some of them perhaps back into part-time employment. We want each and every one of them to find their way back into a job, because we know that there is no economic recovery unless we are bringing all of those people along with us and leaving nobody behind. 10,500 workers who are in many cases going to need retraining. Well, who's going to do it? This government has ripped the guts out of TAFE, weakening its capacity to be retraining the workers to meet the economic needs of a recovery. We have had over 800 TAFE teachers lose their jobs over the last 8 years on this government's watch. It's more than 100 TAFE teachers each year, less than the year before. Deputy, in my own electorate, they've closed down an entire campus at Dapto, one of the biggest, fastest growing suburbs. It'll be called a city within a few years' time in my electorate, and it doesn't have a TAFE. It was being closed down on this government's watch. We've seen a 20% fall in the number of skilled training places available over the last 8 years. It's a pretty sorry record when you look at it. 800 fewer TAFE teachers, the closure of TAFE campuses in my electorate and right around the country, and a 20% fall in the number of skilled training places available to young Australians leaving school or Australians seeking to re-enter the workforce. That's what happens when you hollow out the skills and training system. You also hollow out the industrial capacity of this country, and you hollow out the future of our workers. You imperil the economic recovery from a once-in-a-100-year pandemic. It's for this reason, Deputy Speaker, that I felt necessary that we move the second reading amendments, because this bill has all the right headings, but not enough substance, particularly in the area of reskilling and retraining as we recover from the pandemic. Imagine how those 10,500 workers in my electorate feel today. Do they look at the coalition and think, there's a Prime Minister, there's a government that has got my back? No, they aren't. They're not hearing from this government, we'll get more training places so you can get back into the workforce. They're not hearing from this government that we want you to grab those job vacancies that industry needs to be filled. All they're hearing from the Liberals is a plan to import skilled workers from overseas to fill those jobs that can and should be done by locals. Can and should be done by locals. Don't get me wrong, a level of skilled immigration is an important component in our economic growth, and I welcome it. But it can't be the only answer. It's a pretty lazy answer, isn't it? I mean, we don't oppose the removal of the $350 per annum threshold that is contained within the bill. But what we do oppose is this government's abject failure to confront the skills crisis. The answer cannot just be, let's import workers from overseas. That's laziness and that is incompetence. Always making decisions for the short term and only ever making a decision after it's way too late. And nothing more can crystallise the approach of this government than that issue. When confronted with a crisis, they do nothing until it's absolutely too late. Always looking for the silver bullet in the form of a marketing catchphrase, never prepared to do the hard yards. Always putting local workers last, putting local industry last and skills training last. I predict that coming the next election, Australians are going to hear a lot of the tired old lines of those opposite about cranes in the sky and getting workers back to work. Everybody wants to see that. But what you won't hear from the Liberals and the National Party is what they're going to do to train the workers in those cranes and on those building sites, and the generation of workers that are going to be needed to repair or renovate your house. Prices are going to go up and up and up, and the opportunity for young Australians and older Australians seeking a second chance is going backwards because of this government's abject failure on skills, apprentices and training. With those very brief comments, Madam Deputy Speaker, I formally move the second reading amendment, which has been circulated in my name.
I thank the member